So this week, just like last week, the sermon is going to be a little different from what we had planned. We've got this series going on right now called Joy Comes in the Morning, an exorcism in 4 parts. And, you know, the idea was and is to do a series of 4 sermons, 3 by me, 1 by Meredith, about the ways that we might heal from the trauma of the past 4 years, sort of from the perspective of, you know, how we can look at the trauma that we are carrying and try to get it out. And have each sermon taking on a different negative feeling or motivation and trying to help get it out of us. But the past couple weeks have been a vivid reminder that the trauma of the past 4 years is not over, and that our task in this moment is, as it often is, to try and address the here and now and figure out how we might respond from a faithful and honest place to the continuing traumas of our time. And we're still going to do that, but with more of an eye to the moment than to the horizon. With that said, I was going to go back to the sermon again and add in something about the impeachment, and then I just thought, nah, they've heard enough about that. And so this week, I want to talk about fear, because this week, perhaps even more than last week, I found myself feeling afraid. With the recent invasion of our capital and the continued threats of more violence by terrorist mobs, this was a deeply frightening week. And I feel like when we talk about fear, it's good to try and be specific about what exactly we mean, because fear is this kind of nebulous concept that means different things to different people, and there are different kinds of fear and different ways that we can encounter and process fear, right? Human beings evolved a sense of fear to keep us safe, right? Because it is helpful for the survival of our species if we don't enjoy situations in which we are in imminent danger. It's important that we are able to be frightened and to be startled. At least a couple times a month, I'm walking my dog down Poplar, and someone, you know, blasts by me in their car and lays on their horn, and every once in a while they even shout, "Reverend Sam!" out the window. And every time I nearly leap out of my skin. It's, you know, I'm so happy to chat with and to meet people from this community anywhere out in the world. But I could do without the honking at me. Anyhow, I react in that way because my body and my instincts are protecting me, right? That's not the kind of fear that I worry about. I worry about what happens when fear becomes such a part of our lives, when we spend so much of our time in that state of mind that I briefly enter when someone blasts their horn at me on Poplar, that our fear becomes what feels normal to us, and it becomes the lens through which we view the world. And part of me thinks this is especially hard for us to talk about as Americans, right? We as a nation are very enamored of this idea of being tough, and we believe that if we are afraid, that means we're not tough enough, right? American men are told our whole lives we have to be like John Wayne or G.I. Joe or Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And we're told these men are afraid of nothing. And so if we want to be people of value, we need to be afraid of nothing too. But this pressure, it doesn't only apply to men. I think it applies across the gender spectrum. Very often, when people want to compliment my wife, Sandra, they talk about how tough she is. They say she's so strong and she's so uncompromising, and above all, she is fearless. And Sandra is those things, and it's wonderful that she is those things. And I still wonder about what can happen to us if we spend so much time denying that we ever feel afraid, right? Because the fear won't go away. It will linger in us, and it will seep out into other parts of our lives. And at this moment, how could we not feel afraid? To live through the time that we are currently living in and to claim to not be afraid would be like being buried under a pile of snow and claiming not to be cold. The global pandemic that we are facing is unlike anything in living memory. As of this writing and this preaching, the number of Americans who are dying of COVID-19 on a daily basis regularly eclipses and surpasses the number of people who died on 9/11. Many of us have lost loved ones. Many of us are fearing for our own health, and on top of that, we have these incidents of hateful violence occurring all over our country and urged on by our president. It would be ridiculous not to be afraid. We have been living in this state of fear for so long that it can be difficult to avoid letting this fear take over our lives. I'm thinking about, this story that we read this morning about Jesus healing this man who is possessed by a demon, and the demon is causing him to become mute. It's a funny little story. It's one of the shortest exorcism stories in the Gospels. It basically just says, what they would call a demoniac was brought before Jesus, and Jesus healed him, and the man proclaimed that he was healed, and the Pharisees started telling people that Jesus was evil. The story doesn't give many details, and it gives no details on the exorcism itself, which is funny because last week I went on and on about how every exorcism narrative in the Gospels gives all the gory details of how Jesus did what he did, and I talked about what that means, but it turns out that all I would have needed to do to see that I was super wrong was to look at the reading that I myself had selected for the following week. But I look at this story, and I think about this invasion of the United States Capitol that happened just last week, and I think the similarities are striking. Because these people who invaded the Capitol, they themselves were muted in a way, right? They weren't physically unable to use words or communicate, but they were so filled up with fear and with negativity that their fear is what was doing most of the talking, to the point where their own voices were barely present. And when people become that overtaken by fear, the results can be disastrous. 5 people were killed in the Capitol last week, and this weekend we honor Martin Luther King Jr., who was somebody who pushed boundaries and spoke out for justice and equality, and who caused such fear in people who were attached to the status quo that one of those people assassinated him only a short walk from where I stand right now. And fear begets fear, right? Because how could a person not feel afraid after witnessing what fear wrought in our Capitol building last week? That was the point. That's what terrorists do. They try to terrify people. The group who stormed the Capitol admittedly didn't seem to be afraid of facing meaningful consequences for their actions, nor were they apparently afraid of COVID-19, judging by their lack of masks, but they were afraid. There were people who had been swept away by their fear that had been nurtured in them by people in positions of authority, people who they trusted. It's interesting to me that the story of Jesus healing this mute man, it doesn't bother with the exorcism itself. It does go out of the way to mention that the authorities around Jesus were really quick to start spreading scary rumors about what Jesus had done. It's important to remember that our president was not the first political leader to see his power slipping away from him and to respond by telling people lies that got them so scared that they lost their ability to speak with their own voice. And so now here we all are, trying to survive this frightening time and trying to figure out how to rise to the challenges of our time in ways that acknowledge our fear but do not let our fear take us over. And that story that we read, just like the one last week, isn't exactly forthcoming with the technical advice. So I want to tell you about this book. This book that was excerpted for our readings today, this book is called Fears of Your Life by Michael Bernard Loggins. Michael Bernard Loggins is a neuroatypical adult living in San Francisco, and he wrote this book with the Creativity Explored program, which is an art studio for neurodiverse people. And the book is a list of fears. There's 183 of them, to be precise. And basically, Michael Bernard Loggins was feeling afraid, and so he wrote down a list of everything that he was afraid of, and many things that he imagined other people might be afraid of, and examined fear and his relationship with fear and what fear means. And the result is one of the most amazing books I have ever read. It has been featured in galleries all over the country. It's a celebrated work of genius by anybody who's read it. Ira Glass from This American Life described the book as Talmudic. I found out about the book a few months ago. I heard an excerpt of it on a podcast that I was listening to, and I was so blown away that I screeched my car over to the side of the road, put my hazard lights on, and got my phone out and ordered 3 copies right then. I couldn't bring myself to wait to get home. And then the book arrived, and I just sat there on the floor of my office reading it over and over again and just marveling that a person could be so honest and brave, and realizing that I had spent months trying so hard to be strong and to be in charge and to be fearless because I was a minister. I was a minister leading a congregation in a pandemic, and I was about to be a father, and the world needed me to be stoic and unshakable when really I was terrified, right? I mean, that's why I responded so strongly to this book. You know, I had just tested positive for COVID-19, and my wife was about to have our first child in a matter of weeks, and the president was bellowing threats of violence, and my congregation was about to go 2 months without me in the middle of the deadliest pandemic in living memory, right? I can look at those guys who stormed the Capitol, and I can talk about how they were taken over by unchecked fear, but I have to tell you, there's been several times in the past 10 months when I have felt like I was a hair's breadth away from losing myself to my fear. I think that's true for a lot of us. And so the answer isn't to pretend that we aren't afraid. The answer is to be like Michael Bernard Loggins and to name our fears in a way that is honest and real and that is also kind and compassionate to ourselves. Because there is no antidote for fear that works quite as well as saying things that have been going unsaid. I keep telling myself that the instinct that causes me to leap aside when somebody shouts at me from a speeding car, that is the same instinct that causes us to recoil at the horrors that happened in our Capitol building. It is a gift. In Fears for Your Life, Michael Bernard Loggins asks the following questions. And please note, as I said earlier, but podcast listeners might not have heard it, that I have left Michael's phrasing intact because I would never presume to mess with a piece of writing by somebody so much wiser than I am. He writes, "Does fear make you smart, or does it take you over? It tries, but it also saves your life." You know, during this pandemic, I made a whole bunch of pastoral phone calls, and a lot of people have told me that they're scared and that they're upset and that they're frustrated, and I feel horrible for those people, but I don't worry about them as much as I worry about the people who tell me that they're doing fine and that they don't think any of this is even really a big deal. The work that we are called to do on ourselves at this time is not the work of trying to convince ourselves that everything is okay or that we aren't scared of what isn't okay. The work is in not letting our fear speak for us and leave our truer selves mute. And the work also lies in asking for help and in trusting each other to see when our fear is taking over and to help us get to a better place. I love that the man in the story is brought to Jesus by his friends, right? He acknowledges that he needs help. His friends acknowledge that he needs help, so they take him to a spiritual presence. They lift him up in their religious community, right? We see somebody in a spiritual community being told, you don't have to let this fear render you unable to express your own truth. Unitarian Universalism is a religion founded on the idea that our individual stories and truths are sacred, even as our bodies are separated by this pandemic. Now more than ever, it is the role of our community to come together in our fear and in our grief, and to allow the people who love us to give us the courage to be as afraid as we need to be, and the courage to love and build even so. Amen.